During the night of September 12, 1983, one man carried out what was, at the time, the biggest cash robbery in American history. Millions of dollars were lifted as Víctor Manuel Gerena devised and executed a plan to exploit Wells Fargo's skimpy security protocols. But there was far more to this robbery than met the eye. It spurred from a much grander international political motive, with 16 more people involved behind the scenes. Some of the accused remained on the run for decades, leading the FBI on a wild goose chase. Did the authorities eventually track them down? How'd the successful heist play out? And what was this overarching motivation? Let's find out. To illustrate how these 17 individuals collaborated so successfully and carried out one of the most expensive cash heists to have ever occurred on U.S. soil, we need to understand how their victim, the Wells Fargo company, made it so easy. So allow us to set the scene. The location is West Hartford, Connecticut. Here, at 21 Colbro Drive in the Colbro Industrial Park, Wells Fargo had a depot in which it would store significant amounts of cash. The general public remained rather clueless to the fact that they were living next to a metaphorical gold mine, so Wells Fargo didn't mind allowing the West Hartford depot to hold far more funds than most. They were allowed to keep as much as $30 million on site. At the time, the Wells Fargo branch was managed by Jim McKeon. Jim wasn't dirty, but he was inexperienced. After only 5 months of guard duty, the company promoted him to manager. This was mistake number 1. The company also hired workers at minimum wage. This was the case for then 25-year-old Víctor Manuel Gerena. Victor became Jim's second in command and was eventually given responsibility to hold one of the cash vault's keys. As it turns out, that was mistake number 2. About 2 weeks before the robbery, the first steps were put into place. Normally, no vehicle other than the designated Wells Fargo transport vans were allowed inside the delivery van area. It was too risky to let any other car near the vault for obvious reasons. But knowing that his boss was inexperienced and lax, Gerena tested the waters. He rented an ugly duckling rent-a-car and told McKeon that he'd borrowed the van from a friend who would be mad if it was damaged. So he needed to store it within the private parking lot. Even though this was a direct violation of company rules, McKeon let it slide. Mistake number 3. Fast forward to the night of September 12, 1983, and everything was about to hit the fan. Inside, McKeon was at his desk. Outside, a 1973 Buick LeSabre that Gerena had rented sat parked near the vault. While McKeon was doing his regular paperwork to close out his shift, Gerena approached him and tricked him, which led to McKeon looking down the barrel of his own weapon. From that point, McKeon as well as another on-shift coworker were handcuffed. Gerena injected them with a mixture of aspirin and water to act as a sedative, which proved too weak to actually take effect, allowing the pair to watch as Gerena carried out the entire crime. Using a cart, while his coworkers alertly watched on, Gerena made multiple trips between the vault and the Buick until a total of $7,017,152 had been stolen. That's over $18 million by today's standards. Then he fled the scene. Once the police arrived, they assumed that the case was clear-cut since the identity of the perpetrator was known, and there were unquestionable witnesses. So instead of focusing on chasing Gerena and finding him, they focused on securing and investigating the crime scene. However, this crime wasn't clear-cut. There was much more going on behind the scenes than anyone realized. Because the police were prioritizing the scene of the crime, they had unintentionally given Gerena an opportunity to flee. Gerena linked up with 2 associates who were on standby at a motel. These men were part of an organization called the Machete Wielders, but we'll circle back to that in a moment. He gave them the carload of cash as well as his legal ID, and then they split in different directions. The associates drove north toward Boston, deliberately dropping the ID along the way as a decoy. Meanwhile, with counterfeit documents in hand, Gerena went south toward New York, then was transported to Mexico and flown to Cuba. Subsequent searches of Gerena's apartment and his call list came up empty, with only his passport being recovered. Before too long, Víctor Manuel Gerena was placed on the FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives list and remained at large for 25 years. Gerena was merely the inside man and the face of the operation, but there was much more at play behind the scenes. 16 other men were linked to the crime, a crime which had an intricate, elaborate political motivation, including the cost of car rental, purchasing of fake documents, time spent formulating a plan, and arranging for international transport. The gang could have easily spent upwards of $10,000, but that's just an estimation. Now let's rewind for a second. Who were these so-called machete wielders? The name is the rough English translation of the Spanish moniker Los Macheteros, which was a nickname for the Boricua Popular, a guerrilla group that sought Puerto Rican independence from the United States. Los Macheteros had claimed responsibility for a number of attacks against the United States Armed Forces and had a complex, often bitter relationship with America. And as it turns out, the mother of inside man Víctor Gerena, named Gloria, was an ardent supporter of independence for Puerto Rico. With that in mind, it didn't take much for Los Macheteros to recruit Víctor Gerena to their side. Allegedly, the major purpose of this entire heist was to finance the operation of Los Macheteros and fund their stance and action against the United States. Because of the fact that Víctor Gerena fled to Cuba, many investigators believe that the Northern Caribbean nation was a player in the heist as well. Some people, including a former Cuban intelligence agent, have claimed the government of Fidel Castro helped finance the Wells Fargo heist, although we'll never know for sure. Over the following 2 years, the FBI gathered its information. Meanwhile, Wells Fargo was offering $350,000 in reward for Gerena's capture. The FBI determined that Víctor Gerena had planned to take credit for the heist on behalf of Los Macheteros in a press event to be held on September 24, 1984. This piece of information pushed the FBI to focus their investigation on Los Macheteros down in Puerto Rico. And the alleged leader of the group, Filiberto Ojeda Rios, was among many now in the limelight. Two brothers, Avelino and Norberto Gonzalez, were also under fire. Eventually, after another year of investigative digging had passed, and after the list of suspects had been carefully created and checked, the FBI made their move. During the morning of August 30th, 1985, the FBI conducted unannounced raids, without warrants, in more than 30 separate locations in Puerto Rico. Everywhere, from Carolina to Caguas, Bayamon to Vega Baja, and Luquillo to Guaynabo. Juan Segarra Palmer, one of the leaders of the group, was sentenced to 65 years in prison, but had his sentence commuted by former U.S. President Bill Clinton. On that morning, all but 4 of the suspects were arrested and charged with involvement in Macheteros activities and the Wells Fargo heist. This was far bigger than simply arresting those responsible, though. As the FBI tried to prosecute the perpetrators, Puerto Rican groups fought back. In December of 1985, a Puerto Rican nationalist paper called Libertad warned the American federal government that if the arrests continued, they should begin preparing their cemeteries also, because they intended to send mercenaries to American soil. Remember, some of the suspects still remained at large. Filiberto Ojeda Rios had skipped bail in 1990 while awaiting trial, as Víctor Gerena and the Gonzalez brothers, Norberto Gonzalez and Avelino Gonzalez Claudio, remained on the run. Avelino Gonzalez Claudio was finally captured in 2008 and sentenced in 2010 to 7 years in prison for his role as one of the robbery's masterminds. He pleaded guilty to conspiring to rob the Wells Fargo Armored Service Corporation and to transporting the stolen money to Mexico. Avelino's older brother, Norberto, was seized in 2011, found living in the small southern Puerto Rican mountain town of Calle. While authorities did not disclose what led to the arrest, they did admit that the 65-year-old at the time had managed to escape capture for a quarter of a century by laying low and operating under an alias following the famous robbery. Once caught, Norberto was forced to face multiple charges that included bank robbery, foreign and interstate transportation of stolen money, and conspiracy to interfere with commerce by robbery. He pleaded guilty to these charges as well as illegal possession of an automatic weapon. As for Filiberto Ojeda Rios, the leader of Los Macheteros, he was taken down in a shootout in 2005. Of the 4 arguably most involved suspects, one is still yet to be found: the plan's centerpiece, Víctor Manuel Gerena. So as we know, the money didn't remain in the USA. Just like Víctor Gerena, it was transported across borders, out of reach of easy FBI discovery. About $80,000 in what was believed to be the stolen cash was uncovered in searches across Puerto Rico and Boston, but the rest remained unaccounted for. So what exactly was this $7 million used for? The federal government contends that the group spent about $1 million. This was supposedly used to fund education, food, housing, clothing, and toys for children to the poorer Puerto Rican communities. Of the remaining $6 million, $4 million was scattered across safety deposit boxes, savings accounts, and farmhouse cellars in Puerto Rico, while the other $2 million allegedly ended up in Cuba. But why Cuba? Because, as we touched on earlier, allegedly they were involved. A former Cuban intelligence agent named Jorge Massetti testified to U.S. authorities that the Cuban government provided $50,000 in seed money for the robbery. Massetti claimed to be involved in shipping some of the $7 million haul from the Cuban embassy in Mexico City to Havana. However, Cuban officials have labeled this story as entirely false. Let's take a step back for a moment. The ideology-driven thieves took the modern equivalent of $18 million, but once you factor in the cost of an ongoing 25-plus-year investigation, the overall cost grows tenfold. A National Institutes of Health study from 2007 indicated the following. As a result of the 23 million criminal offenses committed in 2007, victims lost close to $15 billion. In order to solve these same crimes, government agencies spent approximately $179 billion. So for every $1 stolen, it took $12 to solve the crime. If we loosely apply this ratio to the Wells Fargo heist, we can infer that the FBI spent $84 million, which is over $200 million when adjusted for inflation, trying to catch the masterminds. Considering that the operation's frontman is still on the loose, that number can only continue to grow. The FBI offered a reward up to $1 million for information leading directly to the arrest of Víctor Manuel Gerena. Even though the Wells Fargo heist was the most expensive cash robbery in American history at the time, it no longer holds that title. A man named Alan Pace led the 1997 Dunbar Armored Trucking Company robbery. Together with 5 childhood friends, Pace broke into the vault, neutralized 2 guards on their lunch breaks, and loaded $18.9 million into a U-Haul. Taking inflation into account, that's a hefty $30 million payday. But that's a story for another day. Where do you think Victor could be hiding? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, thank you so much for checking out The Richest. See you next time and have a great day.